All right, good to be with you all tonight. So now we're going to shift over into the forage realm, and about and let me see if I can change my slide. Okay, so this is the time of year when people start to worry, and we start looking at the forecasts and the precip that's fallen, and we start to this is when we start to wonder whether we're making good decisions on what we're planning to grow the next year and whether we should make a shift. And so typically when our year's shaping up like this, we can expect our crops to look something like this the next year, where we have just some tiny little we kind of have crop circles going on and droughted areas and not very good production. Then as soon as we start to feel like this is going to happen, then we do an awful lot of praying, and then we wind up with something like this, and then we call Earl and ask if we can grow rice in Utah. So it's always one thing or the other, but I think it's safe to say that people are always looking for alternatives and things that maybe they weren't planning to use, and some things that they can jump into. So Ryan talked a lot about this, but why would we consider annual forages? Well, I think the number one reason is because these annual forages use familiar production practices and equipment. And so the annual forages are not things that a grower would have to go out and invest in a lot of new equipment and technology in order to grow them. Everybody in this area has got a swather and a baler or a chopper, and we can put these things up and we can do a nice job at it. So these are the crops for everybody. These annual forages open up the potential for double cropping, which can be a really nice option to grow maybe take a first cutting of alfalfa and throw one of these other crops in and do something with that, and then come back with something else in the fall, or grow a small grain for hay, and then throw a warm season annual behind it. These are great options for emergency forages to be able to, when the unexpected happens, we can jump in and throw one of these other crops in. And then the other thing that we can do with annual forages is these can be really nice for replacing a forage production gap in a cool season crop, like a pasture where we have that summer slump. We're not going to have as much feed. You can throw one of these warm season annual forages in and really help to make up for that decline. So today we're only going to focus on two. So we're going to talk a little bit about the sorghum and the sorghum family, and then we're going to talk a little bit about teff. So I think we would all agree that corn is a really, really nice crop to grow. We love growing corn. It's very productive. It's nutritious. It's worth good money. And so I think most growers, if you have a market for corn, you try to grow as much corn as you can. However, one thing that doesn't work with corn is dry conditions. And so if you're in a situation where you can't provide full irrigation to corn, you are better off crying uncle and not doing it. Because if you try to go through with it and you got all that expense in seed and in weed control and fertilizer, then you wind up with a helpless situation where what can you even do with it if it's not going to make it? You really have no options with corn. And so this is where Sudan grass and the forage sorghums come in. And the first question that I'd like to, I guess a common question that we face is, what's the difference between a forage sorghum, Sudan grass, and the sorghum Sudan hybrids? And so first we'll talk just a little bit about that. So forage sorghum is tall. So it's going to be 8 to 13, even 15 feet tall. So it grows really big. And when you can tell that it's a forage sorghum when the leaves and the stems look very similar to corn. It's got that wide leaf and a larger diameter stalk. And you can see a picture here of some forage sorghum. This is one of my former grad students. He's about 6 feet tall, and you can see the size of that crop. It's absolutely monstrous. The primary use of forage sorghum is going to be in silage. So next is Sudan grass, and so Sudan grass is going to be a lot shorter. It's about 4 to 7 feet tall, and it's got more grass-like leaves, so about a 1/2 inch wide leaf, and stems that are only about a 1/4 inch diameter. So very fine leaved and stemmed type plant. And as you can imagine, it has way better drying characteristics if you wanted to make hay. So we would go with a Sudan grass there. Now, a sorghum Sudan hybrid is a cross between forage sorghum and Sudan grass. And so it makes sense that all of these characteristics that we talked about before are going to be in between for a sorghum Sudan. It's just an intermediate, it's got intermediate size leaves that are in between forage sorghum and Sudan. The stem size is going to be in between those two, and the height is going to be in between those two as well. So why would we consider sorghum Sudan? Well, the strong point of these crops would be these can be high yielding with limited water. So they have a very high water use efficiency, so that per inch of water, the relationship between an inch of water and the tonnage that it grows is very high and way better than corn can do. These are drought tolerant crops. They can handle periods with no water, and then when water's added to it, they can start
need a battery.
These are cheaper. The seed cost of these is much cheaper than corn, just a few dollars compared to 100 plus that you may face per acre with corn. And you have a lot more harvest options where you can go in with you can cut these with a swather, you can cut them with a forage harvester, chopper, whatever you've got. The negatives is, in general, the nutritional value is lower. I have a question mark because some of the BMR, the brown midrib varieties of sorghum can actually be reasonably comparable to corn. You can have lodging issues. You've got a finer stem, and so when you get a wind or certain conditions or certain varieties, hybrids, you can actually get it'll lay over on you. And there's a lot fewer weed control options than corn. So agronomy wise, with these plants, we plant them later than corn. So in late May or early June is when these would typically go in the ground. We want land that's got good drainage. So land that could grow corn if you had good water. You can plant sorghum and it'll do well in those environments. One option is to harvest once late in the summer or early fall, but you can also cut more frequently and get multiple cuttings if you're doing green chop and pasture. But your highest yields will be with one cut at the end of the season. But you can do some really neat things with it if you start going after it with multiple cuttings. So as I mentioned, this plant does not like cold soil. It's planted after corn, and you want to target soils that are, I've got here minimum of 60, but I feel a lot more comfortable with 65 or 70 degree soil temps at 4 inches down. So it's got to be pretty warm, and then it'll jump right out of the ground. A lot of seeds per pound, so 16,000 seeds per pound, but it does vary by variety. And so seeding rates, you'll go with about a 15 to 25 pounds per acre if you're planting with a drill. And if you're going with a planter on 20 or 30 inch rows, you're probably going to be in that 5 to 10 pound per acre range. So a bag of seed can go a long way. You're going to seed this 3/4 inch to 1.25 inches deep when your soils are heavier, and then you'll just increase that a little bit as your soil lightens up to about 2 inches with a sand. You're going to apply P and K according to soil test recommendations. This crop does require a fair amount of nitrogen. It's going to take about 200 pounds for the season. And so if you short it nitrogen and turn it yellow, it's not going to yield very well. Typically, we lay down about 100 to 135 pounds of nitrogen at planting, and then and then if you're doing a multiple cut system, you'll put the balance on after that first cut to help get that second cut going. The harvest interval, it's a quick grower, so it'll reach a point where you could cut it in about 45 days, but the longer you wait, the higher your yields will be. So harvest wise, you're dealing with, it's going to be fairly similar to corn, where here's where they've allowed it to grow big. They've gone in with a big chopper with a Kemper header, and they're just blowing it into a truck like you would with corn. So, and it's harvested about 60 to 70% moisture, just like corn is for silage. This is a variety trial that we did a number of years ago. Don't worry about the names of these varieties, but that's a nice comparison of the forage sorghum versus Sudan grass versus sorghum Sudan. And what you'll notice is, adjusted for moisture, these are actually pretty good. So this would be 65% moisture. We're at 25 to 27 tons per acre. And so yeah, good yields from these. And it didn't take near the water that it does for corn. So now we're going to shift to teff grass. And my introduction to this crop happened when I was at the University of Nevada about 10 years ago, 15 years ago. And so this is a field of teff. It's an annual forage that's, this one's just about ready to harvest. You'll notice one of the characteristics of it is when it gets big, it does tend to want to lodge. But teff is a crop originally from Ethiopia. It's a warm season grass, so it's not cold tolerant. Whenever it sniffs frost, it dies. And you need to plant it every year, but very small seeded, probably the smallest seeded crop that I've ever encountered. This 1.25 million seeds per pound. When you handle this, it basically pours like water. The seeds are so fine. It can be used as either a grain or a forage. Originally, it was used as a grain crop in its native land, but more recently discovered its value as a forage because things really like to eat it. The hay is very palatable. It's highly digestible. It's very similar in quality to Timothy. And so the horse people absolutely love it. And it's probably grown on a few thousand acres in Utah today. So why would we consider teff? Number one, it's a good producer. It produces good yields, and it's a very high quality for a grass. It's drought tolerant, so there's some water savings there. And one of the experiences that I remember is when I was at the University of Nevada. A farmer was growing teff, and it was all flood irrigation on that border check type system. Farmer had the teff up and growing, and they were watering, I think, on a 2-week interval. So every 2 weeks they had the water, and they'd shoot a flood out across it. And this farmer, you kind of have to guess how long to leave the water going, and then you turn it off, and it kind of cruises to the end of the field, and you move it over to the next area to irrigate. This farmer miscalculated, and so the water on that check did not get to the end of the field. And I remember watching that with great interest, because what happened is, so it missed that irrigation at the end of the field. That teff turned as brown as can be, and you thought he'd killed it. And kind of interesting as when he got the water the next time, so 1 month later in Nevada, with really high temps, shot the next irrigation out across there, and that stuff, as soon as it saw water, it seemed like within 2 hours, it turned green and started growing again. So it has the ability to shut down and come back when you do get water. So kind of nice that way. It's got a really strong price. The price on teff is usually pretty similar to what a premium type alfalfa would go for. And it's mostly going into the horse market, but we've done some trials feeding it to dairy animals, and they do really, really well on it. And then it's a short season summer forage type alternative, which is kind of nice. So this is the size of teff. And so here's a dime, and you'll see right here, here's a couple of little teff seeds. It's just, you won't believe how tiny this seed is. But that one seed can produce a pretty big plant. Look at the number of tillers that single plant produced. That's kind of a trophy, but just shows you its potential. So you want a seed bed similar to growing alfalfa. So you want that nice firm seed bed like you do for alfalfa. You're going to try to plant after that last spring frost. And so around Most of Utah, that's going to be early June. And you can either broadcast it or drill it. You plant it only about 5 pounds to the acre. And so basically what you're doing, if you have a drill, you're trying to drill seed it, is you pretty much close the drill all the way, and then just enough seed will kind of get past the closed drill going through the cracks to plant it about 5 pounds per acre. It does take fertilizer, so about 60 pounds at planting, and then after first cut, another 60. The irrigation, again, it grows. It is drought tolerant, but the more water you can pour to it, the better it does. Like about anything, weed control is going to be 2,4-D, and the harvest about 50 to 60 days after you plant, you'll get your first cutting, and then that second cutting will come in about 45 days. So this shows what teff seedlings look like, and you can see how tiny they are. And just, you almost have to get down on your hands and knees to see these little guys starting to grow. But even though they're small above the ground, they start to throw on a really impressive root system really quick. And that kind of sets it up for later in life. This is a field of teff picture from Fallon, Nevada, where I was in June of 2006, so June the 8th. And this is kind of what it looks like, and you'll see that the teff's probably an inch or two tall. And I'm going to fast forward to that next picture, and so this is about 40 days later. It's already been cut and it's in the bale. And so it grows really quick. But what will happen with this crop is it'll grow up about, it seems like it takes forever for teff to get 6 inches tall. And you're thinking, man, this is never going to grow. And then all of a sudden it'll explode and it'll just take off and really surprise you how fast it'll grow once it gets going. But when it's a young plant, it's trying to put roots on, and that's why it grows slow above ground. And then this is a field that's just ready for harvest. Actually, probably a little bit later than we'd like to harvest. You'll see the seed heads have come out pretty strong, but again, showing that it'll have a tendency to want to try to lay down on you when it gets big. This is some data from Utah. We did these trials in Kaysville for a bunch of years, just near Bountiful, north or south of Ogden. And what we're showing here is looking at nitrogen rates, so 0, 25, 50, or 100 pounds to the acre split. Well, sorry, not split, but this would be before each cutting. So at planting and then after each cutting. And then there's our yields in harvest 1 and then harvest 2. So you'll see that when it's very responsive to nitrogen. So when we put down 100 pounds of nitrogen, we got about 2.5 tons to the acre dry weight in that first cutting. And then in that second cutting, we got almost 3 tons to the acre for about 5.5 tons total on the season. And the other thing you'll notice is look at the protein. When you fertilize it well, we had 16.5 on the protein on this crop, which is really nice. And it just makes really, really good feed. But when you short it nitrogen, you'll see it both in terms of the yield and in the nutritive value of the crop. I wanted to spend just a minute on teff grain production because the agronomics of teff grain production are the same as forage, with the exception that we seed at a lower rate. So you'll only plant it at about 2 pounds to the acre. We fertilize with only 60 pounds of nitrogen at planting, and then we harvest about 3 months after we put the seed in the ground. So it's a pretty quick turnaround. And so here we actually windrow it. So you'll go in and you'll lay it. You'll take a swath, or you'll have to take the roller crimper off, open the throat up, and you lay it in windrows. That'll help it to dry so you can get in and harvest it with a combine with a pickup type head to it. And when you use a combine for this crop, it's really important that you pay attention to any holes or cracks or crevices where you could lose seed. And so typically a farmer will need to invest in a case of both duct tape and silicone to seal up all the cracks in the machine in order to hang on to the crop that you've worked so hard to achieve. And you also have to get different screens than you'd ever have used before, I'm sure. But you put those in and then crank the combine down, and it does a really good job. This is the harvested crop in these tote bags that then will go off and go to whoever's buying the teff seed. And one of the unique things about teff is you can come in and harvest it for grain, and then you lay it in a windrow, and just a couple days after you lay it in a windrow, you can combine it, and then you'll pretty much follow right behind the combine with your baler, and you can actually capture an awful lot of the green color of the crop in the quote unquote straw that can actually go into the hay market. And so what these farmers were finding is they could pretty well cover their production costs with the hay, and then the grain ended up being all gravy for their operation. They ended up making pretty good money on this particular crop. So I'll show you. I show you this because I know I've heard from a couple of buyers in the past, within the past this past year or two, that are looking. They would love to expand acres into Utah. So if you might be interested in trying something like this, just shoot me an email, and I can send you their contact info, and you can get a hold of them. But if anybody decides they want to try to grow teff, just give me a reach out to me. I've done it on my own farm when I lived in Nevada. I've done a lot of research on it, and I've made just about every mistake there is to make. So you can probably learn a lot from the school of hard knocks that I went through. But